Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, education in this country is facing a crisis. If we look at our schools carefully, we find out that there are a lot of drugs in our schools, actually murders occur in our schools, rape occur in our schools. It's infested with teenage pregnancies. There is total disrespect for authority in many of our schools, and there's no good record to show that the academic progress is being made that is necessary. The president happens to believe that if we have national testing, this will solve all our problems, and now he's addressing these very, very serious problems that we have in our schools with saying that if we can only get these kids not to smoke a cigarette, maybe we're going to solve these educational problems. I would say that he's going in the wrong directions. These are serious problems and we must do something, but pretending that we're going to crack down on kids testing a cigarette, as bad as it is not going to solve our problems. I have a couple suggestions to make on what we can do to improve the educational system. I have a bill that I've introduced recently. It's H.R. 3626. It's called the Agricultural Education Freedom Act. This is a bill I think everybody in this body could support. What it does, it takes away taxation on any youngster who makes some money at one of these 4-H or Future Farmers of America fair. When they sell their livestock, believe it or not, we go and tax them. Just think of this. The kids are out there trying to do something for themselves, earn some money, save some money, and go to school. And what do we do as a Congress? We pick on the kids. We go and we tax these kids. I talked to a youngster just this past weekend in the farm community in my district, and he told me he had just sold an animal for $1,200, and he has to give $340 to the U.S. government. Now, what are we doing trying to destroy the incentive of these youngsters, assuming some responsibility for themselves? Instead, what do? We say the only way a youngster can ever go to college is if we give them a grant, if we give them a scholarship, if we give them a student loan. And what is the record on the payment on student loans? Not very good. A lot of them walk away. And then there's also the principle of it. Why should the federal government be involved in this educational process? And besides, the other question is if you give scholarships and low-interest loans to people who go to college, what you're doing is making the people and the people who don't get to go to college to pay for that education, which to me doesn't seem fair. It seems that the advantage goes to the individual who gets to go to college, and the people who don't get to go to college shouldn't have to subsidize them. I think it's unfair to pick on these kids. I think it's time that we quit taxing any youngster who makes some money at a 4-H fair or a Future Farmers of America fair where they're selling their livestock and they're trying to earn their money to go to college. I think it's proper to say that they should have no taxation without representation. They're not even old enough to vote. And here we are taxing them. I mean, that's not fair. So I'm hoping that I get a lot of co-sponsors for this bill, because there's sure a lot of youngsters around the country trying to assume responsibility for themselves. I do not believe for 1 minute that the president's approach that we are going to assume that every kid is going to grow up to be a smoke fiend, and if we don't do something quickly, we're going to have them developing all these bad habits. At the same time, we see the deterioration of the public educational system. Also, I would like to mention very briefly another piece of legislation that would deal with this educational crisis. The federal government has been involved in our public schools for several decades. There's no evidence to show that as we increase the funding and increase the bureaucracy, that there's been any improvement in education. Quite to the contrary, the exact opposite has happened. So I would say there is a very good practical case. I know the constitutional argument doesn't mean much, but the practical case is there's no evidence that what we have done so far has been helpful. I have another piece of legislation that would give $3,000 tax credit to every family for every child that they want to educate by themselves. So if they would spend any money on their child, whether they're in school or out of school, in private school, at homeschooling, they would get this $3,000 credit. I hope my colleagues will take a look at these two
Gentleman's
pieces of
time has
legislation.
expired.